Behind every amazing flavor is an amazing human who has perfected their craft. Welcome to Flavors Unknown, a behind-the-scenes look at new flavors and the chefs, pastry chefs, and bartenders who create them, with your host, Emmanuel.
I am your host, Emmanuel Roche. Thank you very much for listening today. Every other week, I interview chefs, pastry chefs, and bartenders to discover their secrets behind the scenes. I want to know what compelled them to become a chef or a bartender. I want to learn everything about their creative process and discover the unknown ingredients that are finding their way in their drinks and dishes. Before I introduce today's guests, I would like to thank everyone who has already taken the online survey to give me feedback about my podcast, Flavors Unknown. I will step-by-step integrate your recommendation. In fact, if you already go to the website, you see that I have made some modifications based on your comments. And I am looking for potential guests related to the topic that you have suggested. I welcome everyone's input. So if you haven't done it yet, please take the survey. I promise it will take you only 5 minutes. It is anonymous, and you can find the link at flavorsunknown.com. You have to click on the contact page, then scroll down, and then you will reach the section called the podcast survey. Thank you in advance for your feedback. It really matters a lot to me. I am really pleased to have another pastry chef on Flavors Unknown. It is a woman this time, and her name is Emily Spurlin. She's a pastry chef at the restaurant Bad Hunter in Chicago. She's a pastry chef, but she started as a line cook, and she fell in love with pastry while attending a French culinary school in Paris. Now, at Bad Hunter, she is integrating vegetables in her desserts, and she's experimenting with fermentation. Please listen until the end of the podcast because Emily is going to share with us a series of desserts that you can do at home when you are having a party or entertaining guests. And I believe that I forgot to mention that today is episode number 15. Hey, hi, chefs. I'm really happy and pleased to have you on Flavors Unknown today. How are you?
I'm so great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thank you. We had a very exciting experience at your place. I had the pleasure to try some of your desserts. I think it was about a year ago in Chicago at Bad Hunter. And there was some fascinating experience and it stuck to my mind and I'm very pleased to have you.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here.
You are a pastry chef at Bad Hunter in Chicago. So can you talk to us a little bit about what is Bad Hunter in terms of a restaurant and as well, what's your program in terms of dessert and pastry at that place?
We're a vegetable-focused restaurant in Chicago. So we focus a lot on seasonal produce-driven cooking, supporting local farms, and sort of just like celebrating Midwest produce. We're not inherently vegan or vegetarian, but we have a big population who are. So we do tend to try to strive to do vegan and vegetarian food that doesn't sacrifice any, flavor or texture. And as far as my program specifically, we do lunch and dinner service. So I have plated desserts and scoops of ice cream. We do brunch. So I kind of have a focus on laminated pastries and other brunch pastries like that. And we also have a private dining space. So we do, weddings and all sorts of events like that.
And is your program in terms of dessert and pastries connected to the philosophy of the restaurant, which is vegetable centric?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I had been cooking before this job. I started out as a line cook before switching to pastry. So I became really comfortable cooking with vegetables and that was sort of my main palette, I guess. And then switching over, I kind of took that with me a little bit. So that was my style of cooking. And then this opportunity came up and it seemed like such a good fit because I really love using vegetables and other savory ingredients in my desserts. So there's definitely a liaison between the pastry and the savory aspects there.
So I'm curious because, other people that are listening as well, you're talking about dessert and pastry and then we talk vegetables. So can you give us maybe one or two examples of what you have on your menu or things that you are let's say, known for, or maybe a signature dish?
I guess we had a really popular dessert when we first opened. It was a chocolate cremant, and we did a porcini mushroom ice cream with that. I've done parsnip stuff. I've done a sunchoke cake. I've done a semifreddo that was with peas and rhubarb in the spring. That was a hit. And another popular one was a beet and goat cheese mousse with berries and chocolate.
So mushroom and ice cream. Explain that to me a little bit.
Yeah, so it definitely is a little funky, but more than that, it's just really rich and sort of like umami aspect, which I thought paired really well with the dairy. And we also had some frozen grapes, so the acid in the grapes kind of help cut through the richness of the chocolate and the mushroom. And we did a bit of chocolate crumble, sort of like a cookie crumble that had porcini powder in it. So just sort of rich and savory. And
that's interesting because I had recently an episode with Sam Mason from Oddfellows, in Brooklyn. And he was talking, in fact, I had the chance to do one face-to-face with him. The whole shop was smelling, they had the aroma of mushroom. And they said, what are you doing with mushroom in ice cream? And he thought that it was something very interesting as well, because it can really absorb like the sweetness, the sugar, and some of other aroma. And so it's interesting that, that both of you talking about ice cream and playing with, mushroom as an ingredient. So that's funny. So you're saying that you are celebrating local produce in the Midwest and the seasonality. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that and give us some example of seasonal product from the Midwest?
I think Chicago is known for having really brutal winters, which absolutely is true. But the summers here are just glorious. And I think that's why so many people stay here is, it's almost like you forget about the winter when summer comes around. We're super lucky to have a bunch of really amazing local farmers who are just growing amazing produce. So we have really beautiful berries and stone fruits and all sorts of vegetables. And then, we just kind of have to do our best to preserve that in the summer in order to use it through the winter as far as jams and pickles and fermenting. And then in the winter, they are long. And so we have squashes and root vegetables and some orchard fruits and just find creative and new ways to use those. So I always like to say that, we don't have the same sort of year-long amazing produce that people on the West Coast might have. But I truly believe that our joy at like the first strawberries or rhubarb or green vegetables in the spring is absolutely unrivaled. I don't think that anyone gets as excited about that as we do in the spring.
I do remember doing the tour in Chicago, and I think is in June, and there was a lot of rhubarb, on the menus, around the city. So that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And I remember last year we had a really long spring. It was really cold and rainy. So we kind of got stuck with rhubarb for a lot longer than we usually do before the strawberries started coming up.
So you're talking about preserving, obviously, those great products from the spring and the summer. You use the term fermentation, and we have seen fermentation, let's say, very used in the culinary space. It's very trendy at the moment. So you're exploring fermentation in pastry as well, from what you are saying, or in desserts. Can you give us some example of fermentation and I'm guessing pickling and other forms, for your desserts?
Yeah, absolutely. Pickles for sure. We do a lot of pickles that might be slightly on their sweeter side or paired with a super rich dish so that they can cut through that a little bit. We use ferments in the sense of doing vinegars. We're always trying to make vinegars out of our scraps. One of my favorites is just when you hull the tops of the strawberries, just throwing them in and getting them started as vinegar. They still take a lot of the really lovely flavor and color from strawberries, but you're essentially just using something that would otherwise get thrown in the compost. So we make a lot of vinegars. We do kombuchas, and we use kombucha for sorbet or as a starter for creme fraiche. That was actually something we picked up in the Noma fermentation book is flavoring your kombucha with, we were doing like lavender and elderflower and then using that to start a creme fraiche culture. And also sourdough. We do a lot of sourdough starter. We use it for our laminated doughs and our donuts and sourdough bread, obviously, as well.
Kombucha techniques for sorbet. So can you further develop?
We start with tea and sugar, and we add our kombucha. It's called a SCOBY, and that ferments the tea, and it becomes really tart and fizzy and fermented, essentially. And then, you can add fruit purees to it or just do a straight kombucha sorbet. And it just has a really nice, subtle tea, super tangy flavor.
And how are the consumers reacting to it? Because it's pretty surprising, probably in in the ice cream world.
Yeah, it is, and I think I've been really surprised at how adventurous some of our diners are. I think that I almost sometimes feel like I'm like pushing my limits of how weird I can get with dessert to see if people like it. And they do, which is really great because I've worked in other restaurants where it's not the case and, you did anything like beets and it just wouldn't sell. So I feel lucky that people who come to Bad Hunter tend to eat pretty adventurous. I think also things like kombucha is becoming really popular. I think these things that are actually quite ancient and old are sort of becoming revived. I think seeing things like that and, you go to Whole Foods and you can see so much kombucha. And I think it's just exposure. People are getting more exposed to these flavors and becoming more used to it and open to trying it.
And would you say that there is a certain, let's say, a platform in dessert or pastries or ice cream that are more open for that type of exploration and pushing the boundaries than others?
I guess for me, I don't know if this answers your question correctly, but I find that I have to pair the weirdo ingredients with something that people really love and will always go for, like chocolate. I can pretty much pair anything with beets and people will order it. So I usually just try to temper the more bizarre, like more different ingredients with things that are super recognizable and craveable for people. So it kind of gets them to try something maybe a little different than they're used to while still staying in their comfort zone.
So the idea of having almost like an anchor flavor or techniques, and then you can play around and tweak it.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So let's go back a little bit in time, and I'm curious because pastry, and obviously from my accent you can tell I'm French. So we hear a lot about like the techniques, and it's a science. There's really specific recipes and rules and so on. So what was the first things that you learned about creating pastries that really surprised you?
I would say the first thing I learned that was surprising was just the patience involved. And especially coming from cooking, which is pretty quick and fast and on your toes. And usually something that, if you mess up along the way, you can usually save it, whether it's just a seasoning problem or something. And with pastry, you really have to be super careful at each step because each step really affects the final product. And these steps are also very time consuming and require a lot of attention. So just sort of the pace of it, that it's a lot slower. It's taught me a lot about being a more patient person and just the importance of giving things the time it needs to be correct.
So you said that you started as a line cook. So what was the process or what happened, that make you switch into dessert and pastry?
So before I went to culinary school, I was pretty uncertain about whether I wanted to do pastry or be a savory chef. So I just went to culinary school because I had a friend of a friend who said that it might help me be a little more well-rounded. So I did that. I actually studied in Paris. So your accent is very nostalgic for me. But,
which accent? Come on.
Yeah. So I went to school for culinary, not for pastry, but I really still kind of was realizing that I preferred pastry. I had pastry once a week and it was my favorite class and I did the best in that. So then after I lived there for about a year and a half and I moved to Chicago and was just getting line cook jobs because that's what I studied and what I felt a little more comfortable with. And I kind of got, I don't want to say stuck on line cooking, but at a few of the jobs I was working in, I would express interest in switching to pastry. And it was kind of like, oh, but you're great on the line. If we move you to pastry, we have to replace you on the line. So luckily, finally, I was at the Publican, and that's where the pastry chef at the time was Anna Posey, who now owns Elska. And she was the one who kind of helped me make my way over to pastry.
Who inspired your generation, of chef or pastry chefs? There's always, iconic names, from decades after decades, generation and generation. So I'm curious for you, who were those mentors and people that you look up to when it comes to dessert and pastries?
I guess I can't speak for my entire generation, but for me personally, I feel like some of my direct inspirations in Chicago were Dana Cree, Amanda Rockman, and as far as like other legends, I really love the work of Nancy Silverton and Dory Greenspan. Working with Anna was great as well. I think that she has a really artistic approach on pastry that kind of helps me develop my own creativity. Those are some of mine.
Who did you work with when you were in France, in Paris?
my program for school was 6 months, and then I did 6 months of internship. It was just a bistro called L'Orsine. It was really small. It was just the chef. And
how important is the French techniques, in pastry? We know that around the world there's different, influences. Obviously, there's Japanese school, you have, even Germany and so on. But we talk always about like the French technique, in pastry. So do you think that every pastry chef should be able to master those? And then that's, we hear about the fact that creative is great, but you need first to master the basics and like the techniques. And then after that, you can explore, the creativity side. So I just wanted to hear a bit from you. What are your thoughts about?
I think I feel like I can see both sides. First of which being that I do think that it's super important to learn technique before being able to flex your creative muscles a little bit. I think we're all super eager when we're just cooking to be trying a bunch of stuff out, but you might have this great idea, but you have no idea how to execute it. And it can end up being a poorer final product because you didn't really know what you were doing. So I do think it's important to understand like basic science in pastry and basic technique, which of course, like most of it comes from French technique. But I also do think that sometimes it helps you to think outside of the box when you sort of maybe don't have that super traditional training. I mean, I personally didn't go to pastry school. I did have a very like baseline, super simple basic pastry training, which was helpful, but I think it helped me sort of carry some of my savory cooking techniques that I learned while being a line cook into pastry that maybe I would have never come to that conclusion if I had just gone to pastry school. So I think it's both. I do really think technique is important, but as long as you allow yourself to like move outside of that box as well.
Do you think that the technique helps when it comes to structuring a dessert? We talk a lot about the influence sometimes for certain pastry chef about like the architecture influence and the structure of a dessert. Do you think that's the learning the basics of the techniques really help, in terms of play with the different structural effect, of a dessert?
I do. Yeah, I think it's super helpful, to maybe start off by saying, I really want this to be this texture. And then you could try and think of, maybe other recipes you have that texture and, being able to fall back on your technique.
So I would like to talk a little bit about your innovation approach or your approach to innovation. And I'm curious about if you have a certain process for creating a new dessert, and what's the creative process? What's the inspiration come from?
Yeah, so I usually my starting point is usually singular flavor or ingredient that I want to showcase, which often ends up being, a fruit or a vegetable, something nature-based usually, or a flavor combination that I'm interested in trying out. So from there, I kind of go in a number of directions. I either think in terms of color. So I think of foods that are complementary colors or foods that are in the same color scheme that I think might flavor-wise be a good match for the initial ingredient. I also like the if it grows together, it goes together method, which is, if they're coming up in the same season, they likely will be good together. And then I like to think about families. So for example, quince is in the rose family. And I really like using rose in desserts in moderation. I think it's really lovely. And I kind of tied together in my brain that both Persian cuisine uses quince and rose. So then that kind of leads me into a new direction of other flavors I can play with within Persian cuisine, for example, or like buckwheat and rhubarb are related. So kind of just trying to find ways to connect ingredients in my brain that make sense and have context. And then obviously trying it all together and making sure it tastes good. But I'd say that's the beginning of my process.
So there's a lot of research, I guess, on your end.
Yeah, I'm a massive overthinker. So I put a lot of thought into everything I do, which is good. But I also I definitely tend to overthink things sometimes and make it harder on myself than it needs to be. But it's just how my brain works.
So I was very impressed with this dessert. The lime avocado mousse. You remember that you had on the menu with this the mango, and there was a cilantro granita. That was absolutely fantastic. Plus, it was beautiful in terms of color and fantastic for people like me taking pictures and putting them on Instagram. So, yeah. And so, can you describe a little bit what was the inspiration behind this dessert?
Yes. So I can't take full credit for that one. That was a collaboration with one of my cooks, but I did kind of guide her into the direction that it got to. So she was sort of she wanted to do a lime dessert and she was working on sort of like a key lime pie sort of thing. So I was trying to help her do something that felt like her dessert, but also felt like it was a Bad Hunter dessert, which to me is always trying to push boundaries and trying to come up with creative flavor combinations, not at the expense of flavor, of course, but just trying to do something that's just a little different from it being a classic key lime pie, for example. So I suggested pairing the avocado with lime and cilantro. And she was a little hesitant. I think she was like, I'm worried it'll taste like guacamole. And I kind of just said like, well, guacamole's delicious. So, I mean, what's wrong with that? Like pretty much anything can be translated into dessert and taste like a dessert, but still maybe be inspired by guacamole. And there's nothing wrong with that. So sort of trying to like kind of bring her out of her own box of like what makes sense for dessert and just trying to pull inspiration for wherever possible. And it was her idea to add the mango and the tahini spice on top. So.
And that was great. And that's true that when we tasted it, no one said, "Oh, I don't think that anyone had guacamole on their minds," because especially with the mango aspect, and there was a lot of contrast in texture. That was really great dessert. You're mentioning that this is a work that you have done with one of the cook. So, how important is the collaboration aspect of putting together a menu? In the restaurants. So I'm guessing that not all the dessert then come from you or all the dishes come from the chef, but there is a lot of people involved, which is great.
Yeah, definitely. Collaboration is a huge thing for me personally, and also just in Bad Hunter in general. Within my insular team, I find it very important to get input from my cooks on desserts because, I only have my own brain and my own perspective. And, when I tap into their talents and their passions and I get to sort of see their cultures and their perspectives. And, I have a cook right now from India and she came up with this really amazing kulfi dessert that I never would have come up with this on my own because that's not my background, So I think it's really helpful and keeps me inspired. And as far as between pastry and savory, we're definitely always kind of picking each other's brains and working with each other's menus. I'm always finding inspiration in ingredients that they're using or produce that they're using. And they often will pick certain techniques from my menu as well. One of our sous chefs went through a big pastry phase where he had a meringue on one dish at one time. And then I was kind of working with like a Japanese cheesecake recipe. And he thought that was so cool. So he did an asparagus dish with like a Japanese cheesecake situation on it. So yeah, it's fun. We do collaborate a lot, which is helpful for all of us, I think.
You had this first background of being a cook. So I'm curious that first, if you are more inclined of collaborating with the chef, in the restaurant because of your background. And then second of all, how much does it have an influence on the way how you approach your dessert today?
Yeah, I think it definitely maybe makes me feel a little more comfortable in working with the savory team because I'm sort of knowing where they're coming from and the techniques that they're talking about. I feel like I just have a little, I have knowledge in that with it being my background. So it helps me to communicate with them, I think, easier about dishes. And then for me personally, I feel like it's been a really huge inspiration on just like the type of flavors that I gravitate towards and some of the cooking techniques I use. I think it's had a huge impact on how I bake.
So I'm super excited to have you, on the show because first of all, I didn't have a lot of pastry chef yet, so it's great. And second of all, there's not a lot of women that I was able to have so far, and I really want to make sure that I represent them on the Flavors Unknown. I have a series of questions for you because I'm really amazed every time that I am in contact with this industry that it's very much still. Unfortunately, it's changing, but male-driven. So how do you think your career would have been different, and not necessarily better or worse, but different if you had been a man?
It's such an interesting question. It is a little different in pastry because even though the industry in general is very male, pastry is pretty female-dominated. So I feel like my career has been relatively I don't want to say accelerated because that makes it sound like it's too quick, but I feel like I haven't been cooking for an incredibly long time and I feel great about my position now. So I don't feel like I lacked opportunity per se, but I feel like once you are in the position, it still feels a little different sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to get the same amount of respect from cooks that maybe the chef gets if he's male. Sometimes it feels like I have to be a little more persistent in bringing up ideas. Ideas aren't always taken quite as seriously. And I find that there's this interesting expectation of how women should behave in the kitchen. I feel like on one hand, there's this sort of expectation that in order to make it, whatever that means, you have to sort of be, have really tough skin and be more masculine and sort of be one of the guys. And then there's also sort of this expectation to like provide a lot of emotional labor and sort of be the mom of the kitchen. So it's kind of interesting between those two expectations, I guess. So, for me personally, learning that like I do prefer to be an empathetic leader and coworker, and I like to, I sort of have those sort of soft skills, but I'm also not necessarily anyone's therapist. So I've had to learn to, kind of set some better boundaries. And, learning to be assertive and stick up for myself in a way that doesn't feel like I'm acting differently than I feel like my personality is. It's just a different way that we move within the industry. I think that we have to think about it a little more. Not that we should have to, or not that anyone needs to, but just observations, I guess.
No, that's great. And what would be your advice for a young, I would say, woman that is inspiring of becoming a pastry chef?
I mean, of course, like working hard, wanting to go the extra mile, of course, being nice, but still standing up for yourself. Or I shouldn't say nice, just, being a good coworker, being a good team member, standing up for yourself, knowing that like all of our voices and perspectives are really unique and powerful. And, we all deserve a seat at the table when it comes to coming up with dishes or coming up with ideas, or just sort of trying to foster the confidence to like show up as your full self.
And for them that maybe sometimes they don't know what they are going into. And so can you describe a little bit what your typical day is, the schedule of your day?
Luckily, we don't have to start that early. I've been pastry jobs where I have to go in at, 4:45 in the morning. But right now I wake up, I drink my coffee, I have a smoothie. I live in the same neighborhood that I work in. So I walk to work usually around 8 a.m. So I'll check in with my team. Usually the first thing they do is they start taking inventory of everything we have. And from there, kind of starting on our prep list for the day. During that time, I'll be checking emails, checking private events for the week to make sure that we're on top of that. Usually at this point, I'll hop onto the prep list with my cooks. Otherwise, if it's a day where I'm working on R&D or trying to come up with a new menu, I'll be working on that. Usually part of my day is devoted to writing recipes, having meetings, whether we have a weekly meeting to go over our PDRs. We have meetings about PR, stuff like that. And I usually work until about 6 or 7. I'll place orders for the next day, work on the prep list for the next day, make sure, help clean up, make sure everything's all tidy before we head out. And then I go home and I cook dinner with my wife and I hang out with my cat.
So how do you, let's say, schedule throughout the week's time for you to, to really you talk about R&D. So the idea of taking time really to step back and research and be creative and experiment. So how do you organize your schedule, in order to accomplish that? Plus, the rest that you have to, to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, that's finding time to do R&D is probably one of my biggest struggles. It's super hard to find the time just in the day with how much of just the daily stuff that needs to happen. So usually I'll just try and pick a day that's earlier in the week when we have a little less to do, or a day when I have more cooks on staff to help out with the list, and just making sure that my staff is really trained up and knows what they're doing. And, I'm available to ask questions always, but, they have been trained so that they can work pretty independently from me, which is really helpful when I do need to do R&D. But I'd say I get time to do R&D maybe a few times a month. It's not very often, but I would like to be doing it more, but it's just hard to plug that time in when there's so many other things to do,
So can you share with us a little bit of what are like the platforms, of interesting idea that you are researching, at the moment?
At the moment, I'm mostly working on bread right now because we're hoping to start a little bread program at Bad Hunter. I'm doing a lot of work with that. We're currently closed because of the fire we had. So I'm waiting to make sure what season we're going to open in so that I can direct my energy in the right season for R&D. So I'm hoping it'll be spring. So we'll see.
I would like to know if you have any suggestions for someone at home that wants to organize a party and entertain guests. What would be your suggestion in terms of desserts that, we can prepare?
Yeah, for dinner parties, I really think simpler is better, especially at the end of a meal. People have had so much to eat for yourself and also for the guests. But I really love panna cottas. I think it's the perfect little dessert at the end of a meal with maybe some fruit or some nuts on top. I also really like doing for a casual dinner party, a really simple chocolate cake, maybe with some olive oil and flaky sea salt, maybe some creme fraiche. And in the summer, I really just like to poach fruit in a simple syrup that I've flavored. So say it's August, I'll poach peaches and plums and nectarines in a lavender syrup and just serve the fruit as is in the syrup. It's a really delicious end to a meal and it's not too heavy and people love it.
Any suggestion for me to integrate a vegetable?
Absolutely. I think a really good place to start with incorporating vegetables is cakes because, you think of carrot cake. Most people have had carrot cake before. So you can sub the carrots for any other root vegetable. You can do parsnips or sunchokes or rutabaga, whatever sounds good to you, you can sub in. And that's a nice way to sort of dip your toe into starting to cook with vegetables for pastry.
Very cool. Thank you. I'm going to try that. Definitely. Thank you very much. So we have been, talking for a bit more than half an hour here. So I am really pleased that you were able to, to give me your time here for the show. And I want to finish with a series of rapid fire questions, if it's okay with you.
Yes, it's okay.
So where do you go for dinner or for a drink when you are off the clock?
Lula Cafe.
Lula Cafe. Yes, that's great. Both drinks as well?
Yeah, both.
Yeah. Okay. What is your late night craving?
Oh my gosh, fried chicken.
Fried chicken?
Yes.
Like standard fried chicken or with a twist?
I like Korean fried chicken with kimchi. I had it last night, so it's on my mind.
So now I'm thinking about what's your favorite dessert, but listen, from a packaged food company or fast food chain?
Oh my gosh. I really like the frozen custard from Shake Shack. Does that count?
Yeah. Cool. If there's any dessert that you will not eat?
Oh, I don't think there's anything I wouldn't eat. I'm not a huge chocolate fan, to be honest, but I will eat it. Okay,
I join you there. I don't like chocolate in dessert. I like chocolate tablets, but not in dessert. So that's funny.
Yeah. I'm rarely surprised by a chocolate dessert.
And the last one is, can you give me 2 of your favorite cookbook when it comes to dessert pastries?
Yes, I like Chez Panisse Desserts and I like Elements of Desserts by Francisco Mongoya.
Emily, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to had you, on the show. It was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thank you for listening today. No worries if you were not able to write down some information that our guest was talking about, because you can find all of those in the episode show note on flavorsunknown.com. And if you are enjoying the show, please leave a review or a rating, as it helps other people to find it as well. If you have friends that are foodies, please send this podcast their way, as I am always happy to have more people listening. I see you in 2 weeks, and until then, remember that people who love to eat are always the best people.
Thanks for listening to Flavors Unknown. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave a review. Find the show notes at flavorsunknown.com. And if you want to join the Flavors Unknown community, search Flavors Unknown on Instagram and Twitter.